What's going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel Snapper, and we are going to take a look at the best decks in Marvel Snap. Number one on the list remains my current build of Loki. There are normally a few questions that I have to answer about this deck, so let's get them all out of the way at the beginning. First, yes, it is unfortunately worth playing Quinjet and Falcon in the same deck. You kind of just have to deal with it. Quinjet into Loki is so overpowering against mid-range decks that you kind of just have to make the sacrifice, and Falcon is so good with your bounce shell that you do need to run both of them. Next, Cosmo is, take it or leave it. You can play something like Rogue in this slot as well. I think Rogue is a totally fine inclusion. There are no issues that I have when it comes to comparing Rogue and Cosmo. You want to put another tech card in there, be my guest. Third, Shang-Chi is a little bit of an awkward card in this deck because you often have to figure out whether you want to be a Shang-Chi deck or a Loki deck. And I think it's actually the hardest thing about playing this deck properly. When you are in a situation where your Shang-Chi is in your hand, but if you Loki, you get rid of your Shang-Chi and you might end up needing it on turn 6. Those turn 5s have lost me more games than anything else, and you need to actively think about if you want to be a Loki deck or a Shang-Chi deck in each game that you play. Now, moving on to how the deck actually works, I think at this point most people are familiar. Loki Quinjet beats up on mid-range decks, and decks that are a little bit finicky end up falling prey to your scaling threats of the Collector and Werewolf by Night, backed up by interaction like Cosmo and Shang-Chi. You reuse your one-cost cards, reusing Nico is especially powerful in this list, in order to simultaneously fill up your hand and move your werewolf around the board. Your best draws tend to involve one or both of your scaling threats and some combination of Loki plus another card that helps Loki be very good. This is the Meta Predator. It is the best deck in the game. I firmly believe that, and there is, I would say, not a lot of reason for you to play something else unless you're quite bored. I'm not saying it's the best deck in the game by a huge margin. I don't think that's actually true. I think it's pretty beatable, honestly. But it is the best deck in the game, and you do start here no matter what. It is the best deck in the game, but not necessarily unbeatable in that sense. And I do think that I am looking forward to potential balance changes in the future for some of the cards in this list, specifically Loki himself, because I believe that Loki has a deterrent effect on the development of mid-range decks. Once mid-range decks get to the point that they need to get in order to win against other mid-range decks, they end up losing against Loki. Also, on a personal note, I just really like to play some Thanos again. The card Darkhawk has been one of the best cards in Marvel Snap for an extended period of time, and this is my current build of Ock Bounce, and I think this deck is a lot easier to play than Loki, so if you are someone who does not necessarily want to do all the work necessary to get very good with Loki, like learning what your opponents are doing, being able to intuit how good a Loki is versus what your normal deck does, and the contradictions inherent in the Loki list, like running Loki in a Shang-Chi deck or like running Falcon in your Quinjet deck, you can just play this. It's a lot simpler. It makes a lot more sense. It's a lot easier to understand. You can pick it up and play it and get what it's doing pretty easily. You are recycling your one drops. You are making a big werewolf by night. You are putting some rocks in the deck. You are playing a Black Widow or two. You are playing a Nico or two. And you are gradually going to play several demons, perhaps, and maybe repeat some forges over the course of the game. You make a big werewolf. You make some other big lanes. You'll win the game. You also have your one mandatory piece of tech in here that is Shadow King. You can try to move other tech in here. I don't hate it. If you want to play another piece of tech, though, you start to really question the utility of a card like America Chavez. And right now, I do think America Chavez is the key, not necessarily the key, but a pretty important part in the consistency that this deck needs to really compete at the top levels. This is a deck I view as competitive with Loki. It's barely a downgrade, and I do think that if they get rid of Loki, we still end up playing decks that look a lot like this. However, this deck is much more beatable when it has a target on its back than Loki is. Loki has this sort of passive buff where it's just like, it's a mid-range killer, it's a Thanos killer, and these other decks don't necessarily have that. They don't make you feel that sense of hopelessness in the deck building screen. I feel like this deck is more beatable than Loki, and because Loki has taken so much heat, this deck actually gets to exist in a meta that is not trying to beat it. and thus is a very powerful choice. Just a slight aside here, there are other cores that you can use the Bounce Wolf Shell in. I'm not going to devote a ton of time to talking about them, but they deserve a mention. Now that we've gone through the major Bounce Wolf decks, we're going to talk about some of the others real quick. This one is the one composed by Dara JN and TLSG, who it turns out actually independently came to a very similar list. This one uses Gladiator and Dr. Octopus to go with the core, as well as an additional Shang-Chi instead of an America Chavez. But the fundamental core is the same. It's a bounce deck. You're doing the same bounce deck stuff. You just have Gladiator and Doc, and maybe a Shang instead of the Darkhawk package. In a similar vein, the Annihilus deck that I think I like the most right now is another offshoot of this bounce core, and we have, of course, Annihilus and Sentry as the major alterations that we've made from the original deck. We also get some extra use out of the Hood, throwing him over to our opponents after we have bounced him as many times as we want, acquiring as many demons as we can. This is a very solid Annihilus deck, but it is, once again, just an offshoot of the bounce core. Outside of the bounce core, Lockdown remains a compelling threat. Because of the way that the metagame shapes around Loki, Lockdown is a very, very reasonable strategy to play. This list was composed by Oteon. I believe he's Haram on ladder right now. I'm not sure if he changed his name again. But it is meant to restrict the ways in which your opponent can play the game. I know that sounds a little bit obvious, but that's what it does. Now, the thing that this deck really wants to get done, though, is only possible because of the way Loki warps the metagame. And I'm not saying this deck wouldn't be good if Loki wasn't around, but it is taking advantage of specific metagame trends. And what I mean by that is the way to combat Loki is with this early scaling type of card, right? You want to be playing a card that when Loki gets it isn't very good, but when you get it actually is. And the way that tends to look in terms of decks like the bounce shells are cards that are good when they're being bounced, and cards like Werewolf by Night that scale up as long as you have time and board space to invest into them. Because of that, you end up in a situation where these scaling threats, if they don't get that time and that board space, are a little bit weaker. And that is what this deck looks to attack. It attacks the time, Professor X with a Psylocke, obviously, and the board space with Storm, Professor X, etc. It is looking to play a sort of, if you remember the Thanos control, it is Thanos-less Thanos, basically. That is the thing it is attempting to do. It's a very simple, straightforward game plan. I think it's a very, very solid list, but it is definitely benefiting from the ways in which the metagame tells people to play, and that means that there are definitely metagames where this is not the optimal thing to be doing. Metagames full of mid-range giant dorks that make your guys look very small and very embarrassed are not the metagames you want to be playing Professor X in. That said, those mid-range giant dorks are taking a bit of a beating because Loki and Quinjet mean that your opponent just gets to play those same mid-range giant dorks right back at you. That's why this deck can succeed right now. Another one of the classic answers to Loki has been to play Shuri. I know people have seen Gosh's build, I believe Lambie tweeted it, of Shuri, but I don't particularly think Shuri is a great choice right now. I'm putting it on here out of deference to her past performance and because it is a very solid pool 3 deck at this point, but I don't think it's exactly where you want to be. The Echo remains a flex slot. There has still been enough Miss Marvel for it to be a fine choice for me, but if you want to play pretty much any other card there, go nuts. I have no real objection to you doing this. Now, that said, Shuri is probably in a worse spot than it has been previously. I don't like playing it into the lockdown decks unless I draw my vision. Professor X Accelerated is very tough to deal with. And while the Echo does help, it's not, 100% perfect. Plus, Loki players, I feel, have gotten a little bit better at handling this matchup. They know when they need to play Loki. They know whether they need to play, like, okay, you go Loki on 4, then I can play a Sauron, then I can play all their stuff on turn 5. It gets a little bit awkward. Plus, all the Loki players are playing Shang-Chi again. I think the number of Shang-Chis in the metagame is probably higher than it ever has been, and that puts this deck, more than anything else, in a very problematic scenario. The release of Annihilus brought Destroy back into the metagame in a big way, although I have long maintained that it is a legitimately powerful deck. It is a deck that is weirdly hurt pretty significantly by the major tech cards that are seeing play right now, those being Shadow King and Shang-Chi. It is able to overcome them to some extent, but it is still a little bit awkward, and for that reason, I've opted for the Taskmaster build. because being able to go Deadpool Taskmaster on the final turn of the game is pretty much how you want to handle your strategy against those Shang-Chi and Shadow King decks. That's the major thing that I want to get across here. This is specifically built to give this deck a real chance against a metagame that has become increasingly hostile to it. Like, my Loki deck runs Cosmo. This deck doesn't like to see that. Like, this metagame it's fine for it, but because Annihilus has sort of tapered off in play, Destroy has gotten a little bit worse, and because, like, even the Annihilus decks are not fully investing in Annihilus anymore. No one's out here playing, like, Turbo Junk or whatever, which is a matchup that you farm as a Destroy deck, but it also doesn't exist anymore because people have gotten wise to it. Everyone who's playing Annihilus is doing it in, like, a Hood Sentry Annihilus package, and that's really it. And by the time you're able to, like, clean up that Hood Void, it's, like, way too late. You're already looking to do that. Like, you don't get the ability to play these Destroy cards late. So, like, when someone goes Sentry into Annihilus against you, your turn 6 is already mostly spoken for with stuff like Null or stuff like Deadpool Taskmaster. You're already doing a specific thing, and so you end up being actually pretty vulnerable to it, which puts you in a very awkward situation because you want to play this deck to beat Annihilus, but the kind of Annihilus decks people are playing, like, you don't even really do that because they don't give you the time to actually beat them up. And that's an interesting situation for me because that's also the reason why we have the extra Destroy slot in here. Normally there's, like, some debate over whether it should be Deathlock or Hulkbuster, but because there's an uptick in that blowing stuff up, having a thing that blows stuff up in your hand later in the game can actually be quite valuable, hence the need for that extra one in Deathlock. My most successful non-bounce Darkhawk list has been this one. I've been climbing significantly well with it. I'm actually really impressed with it. I know Batman put it into the top 10 earlier. It's a really good deck. That said, I think part of that is because everyone is so sick of playing Loki that you don't run into Loki as much as you probably should. I would not feel overly confident playing this deck into a field of Loki. So it's one of those things where it's like, I don't even know if my experience, even at the top end, is representative of how good this deck actually is. Because when I put it together, I talked to Batman about this. We were both like, no, we should lose to Loki, right? And then we just sort of keep getting away with it for reasons I don't particularly understand. That said, this is a deck that is very much coasting off of the power of Shadow King, actually, in order to keep those collectors and werewolves in check. Shadow King costing 2 is kind of a cheat code in a deck where if you don't get Zabu, your final turn play is often something that costs 4. Pairing a Shadow King with that can let you win 2 lanes. It's kind of one of the best cards in this entire deck. Now, as far as the rest of what the deck is doing, I have opted for an Annihilus package here. I like playing the Hood. It's very, very solid. I like playing Sentry. I can either fill up my lane or I can go for the Annihilus. I tend to not play Sentry out unless I have achieved those conditions, but because there are multiple conditions, either A, drawing Annihilus, or B, filling up the lane, I have found Sentry to be, like, eminently playable. If there's anything bad about Sentry, it's actually that he can still die to Shang-Chi. That's kind of the only thing I really don't like about him right now. He might even be stronger if he was a 4/9. This is the Darkhawk Dino list that won the Team Impulse tournament. Total $2,500 was split among the top finishers. This took first place, and I'm bringing it up specifically to make a point about how mid-range decks operate, which is, if you play this list into a different Darkhawk list that is trying to do something similar but a little bit smaller, you're gonna crush them. The finals matchup was between this deck and a Darkhawk deck that was very teched for Loki, Killmonger, Mobius, Shadow King, all the stuff to beat a Loki. But when they ran into this, they ended up in a situation where they had 3 dead cards. They ended up in a situation where Mystique was, like, the best card possible. They had very few answers to a Devil Dinosaur. They had even fewer answers to something along the lines of Miss Marvel into Mystique on the Miss Marvel. It's a very tough customer of a deck if you are planning to be a fair deck playing interaction. In Magic, there's a saying that a deck full of 3/3s beats a deck full of 2/2s, and that is because the deck that is a little bit bigger will almost always come out on top when both people are doing the same thing. This is especially pronounced with the way Darkhawk decks tend to tech in order to beat Loki. The one that techs less ends up winning those mirrors, but of course they have a worse Loki matchup. And this takes me back to what I was talking about at the beginning when I talk about the deterrent effect of Loki. if I play this into Loki, I basically feel like I lose right off the bat. Like, I am just playing exactly the stuff that a Loki player would lives to see. What I do wonder is if this deck is just finicky enough to make it through. I don't think you're ever supposed to, or ever going to be able to beat something like Quinjet Loki. I just don't think you're ever going to be able to do that. But I do wonder, like, okay, with Mystique, with Miss Marvel, with Darkhawk, these are all big cards, the Dino as well, that are a little bit dependent on other things happening, and maybe you can pick up wins against Loki players who are unable to string the right cards together against you, and you can make that more possible by disrupting them with rocks, by disrupting them with Black Widow, etc. Now, I'm not saying I think this list is necessarily the right way to go, but it is a good way to guarantee that you're going to win a lot of quasi-mirror matches against other Darkhawk lists because you are doing stuff like this. Finally, Yo Woody finished in 4th place on that tournament. I believe, I guess tied 3rd, 4th. They're kind of the same. He made it to the top 4 with this build of Silver Surfer, which I really like. I ended up putting it on a tier list a little bit ago. We're going to have him on the channel so we can dive into it more. But the basic gist of this deck is there's a ton of interaction that you have in the form of Juggernaut, Polaris, Spider-Man, in order to make your opponents into as tough situations. You can do a lot of things that fill up lanes early. You can do a lot of things that fill up lanes late. You end up with Sarah, who is a very good card right now. There's not a lot of Mobius, so Sarah ends up mostly uncontested, and it's a very powerful thing to be doing. You also are just finicky enough that when a Loki Lokis you, you might be able to still win that game because you run all these interesting and finicky cards, and of course you are a Shadow King deck. As always, Shadow King kind of the nuts against Loki. You have seen it throughout this episode of the Top Deck series that there's just Shadow King everywhere. This is another Shadow King deck, and it would be a lot worse if Shadow King didn't exist, but Shadow King exists, and we are still able to play Sarah Surfer as long as we focus on how interactions actually play out. This is a very tough deck to play. Every time I play it, I end up thinking, oh my god, the lines with this thing are very complex. You can feel your brain expanding as you do. I do not necessarily recommend it if you don't want to expand your horizons. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed that iteration of the top decks in Marvel Snap. I tried to really sort of tie together the way in which the metagame is shaping up. This is almost less of a top decks video and more of a like why the metagame is the way it is kind of video. For conclusions, I still think Loki is the best deck. I think basically any of the things in the Bounce shells are totally viable. I think basically any of the things in the Darkhawk shells are totally playable too. I've been playing the Annihilus Darkhawk one a lot on stream. I like it a lot. I do think that if like there was money on the line, I would probably end up playing Loki, but that's not to say like it's the best deck by a huge amount. It's just the best deck in the same way that you can look at 96 and 97 and you know that 97 is more than 96, but it's not by a lot. It's only by 1. And that's sort of how I think about Loki in relation to the rest of the metagame right now. It's not like it's overwhelmingly the best deck. It's just, you know, the best deck by like a little bit. And that is an interesting situation because I think its influence is greater than its power, which is to say the way it influences the metagame is greater than it probably should. But it's just like we've had this beaten into us over the last few months. You just can't do certain things because Loki is around. Like Thanos, for example, I don't ever want to play it because you just get absolutely farmed by Loki. It's tough. And it's also, you know, not good flavor, right? Like I watched Infinity War. I know what happens in that matchup. Why is it backwards in Marvel Snap? Please fix. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for watching. I've been KMBest. I will see you in the next one.